Stop Zero, the Visitor Center. With the loss of Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in February 1862, Confederate forces under the command of General Albert Sidney Johnston are forced to abandon the state of Tennessee. Johnston pulls his Army of Mississippi back to concentrate at Corinth, where he collects more recruits and equipment. He manages to assemble a force of about 40,000, though the troops are mostly barely trained and often poorly equipped. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, the victor of Donelson, is anxious to continue the advance with his 45,000-man Army of the Tennessee against the reeling Southern forces. However, his superior, Department of Mississippi Commander Henry Halleck, orders him to wait until he is joined by the 25,000-strong Army of the Ohio under Don Carlos Buell for a joint operation. Grant reluctantly settles in at a small port on the Tennessee River named Pittsburgh Landing to wait for Buell and the push towards Corinth. Convinced the Confederates are broken as a fighting force, Grant makes no contingency for a rebel attack. His army on the Pittsburgh Plateau is bivouacked in dispersed sectors with no defensive fortifications built, and cavalry scouts and pickets advanced only a short distance. As the troops arrive at the campsites, the first units are the most inexperienced, yet as they move south to make room for those coming in behind them, they end up in the most advanced part of the army. Furthest south, about 4 miles distant, are the inexperienced men of Grant's 6th Division under Brigadier General Benjamin M. Prentiss. To their right, or west, is Brigadier General William T. Sherman's 5th Division, with Sherman's headquarters just northeast of a small country church named Shiloh. He has sent one of his brigades, that of Colonel David Stewart, 2 miles to the east to guard a ford across a local creek. Behind Sherman, the 1st Division of Major General John McClernand stretches northward toward Pittsburgh Landing, and to his left, behind Prentiss, is the 4th Division of Brigadier General Stephen A. Hurlbut. Closest to the landing, that is furthest to the north, is the 2nd Division of Brigadier General W. H. L. Wallace. At Corinth, General Johnston and his recently arrived second-in-command, General Pierre G. T. Beauregard, realize that, if they are to have any hope of defeating the Federals and regaining Tennessee, they must do so before Grant's and Buell's armies can unite into an overwhelming force. They thus make plans for a surprise attack on Pittsburgh Landing. For the assault, the Army of Mississippi, with about 36,000 men, is organized into 4 corps under Generals Leonidas Polk, Braxton Bragg, William Hardee, and John Breckinridge. Johnston's vague plan is to concentrate his attack on his right, striking the left of the Federal line with a surprise blow hard enough to drive it westwards inland away from Pittsburgh Landing. Thus cut off from reinforcement by Buell's army via the Tennessee River, the Confederates will be able to destroy Grant in his isolated position. Johnston finalizes the plan and sets the opening of the march for the early hours of April 3rd, with an attack the following morning. Quickly, the Confederate strategy begins to go awry. Various problems cause many hours' delay, and the army does not begin to move, and then only haphazardly, until late on the 3rd. On the 4th, the day the attack is to take place, the rebel advance is badly delayed by heavy rains that turn the roads to mud. Increasingly heavy firefights break out between the pickets of Sherman's division and the vanguard of the approaching Confederates. Johnston and Beauregard fear they have lost the element of surprise, and the Yankees will entrench in strong defensive positions. But both Sherman and Grant, overly convinced of the weakness of the Confederate army, refuse to take these clashes as a warning. On the following day, the Confederate attack, scheduled for the morning, is once more hopelessly delayed by disorganization and compounded by more heavy rains and mud. General Beauregard argues that, with the element of surprise undoubtedly now lost, the entire campaign should be called off and the army return to Corinth to develop a new plan. However, unbeknownst to him, he need not worry about catching the Yankees off guard. Despite increasing sightings of enemy cavalry, infantry, and artillery by men of both the most advanced federal divisions, Sherman's and Prentiss's, the Federal High Command continues to have, in Grant's words, scarcely the faintest idea of an attack being made upon us. Sherman mocks his subordinates for their warnings about large numbers of Southern troops in front of them. In the pre-dawn darkness of Sunday, April 6, 1862, Confederate troops all along Johnston's line are quietly awoken and prepare for battle. Company captains read a message to their troops from their army commander. "I've put you in motion to offer battle to the invaders of our country. You can but march to victory over the mercenaries sent to subjugate you and despoil you of your liberties, your property, and your honor. The eyes and hopes of 8 millions of people rest upon you. You are expected to prove yourselves worthy of your lineage, worthy of the women of the South, and with the trust that God is with us, your generals will lead you confidently to the combat, assured of success." On the line where Johnston's troops are assembling, Private Henry Morton Stanley of the Dixie Grays, Company E of the 6th Arkansas Infantry, who will outlive the battle and go on to become a well-known journalist and African explorer, stands with his friend, 17-year-old Henry Parker. "I remember it," Stanley will say at that moment, "because while we stood at ease, he drew my attention to some violets at his feet and said, 'It would be a good idea to put a few into my cap, as perhaps the Yanks won't shoot me wearing such a sign of peace.'" The two young men, mustered to enter the hell of combat, stoop to pick flowers. Private Stanley thinks, "It's strange that a Sunday should have been chosen to disturb the holy calm of these woods." Stop 1. Fraley's Field and Say Field. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, concerned by reports from his subordinates of large numbers of Confederate soldiers in their front, Colonel Everett Peabody, commander of the 1st Brigade in Prentiss' 6th Division, orders an unauthorized reconnaissance. He sends a few hundred men, under Major James Powell of the 25th Missouri, out into the darkness to investigate the inconclusive sightings of enemy cavalrymen just south of his encampment. Major Powell heads southwest across Say Field, passing in front of where you are now parked. His men encounter Confederate pickets who fire 3 volleys before withdrawing. Powell forms his men into a skirmish line and continues his cautious advance westward towards a 40-acre cotton patch known as Fraley's Field to your right. You have just walked the approximate route followed by Major Powell's reconnaissance party in the pre-dawn hours of April 6, 1862. Once they enter Fraley's Field at about 5:30 in the morning, the 350 or so men collide with the vanguard of Hardee's Corps, the 280 men of Major Aaron Hardcastle's 3rd Mississippi. A fierce firefight rages in the fields in front of you, with Confederate reinforcements advancing. Powell keeps up the fight for about 45 minutes, but then, facing what he estimates as 3,000 enemy troops, he orders a fighting retreat. He sends notice back to his commander, Colonel Peabody, and pulls his men out, moving east past where you are standing. Union reinforcements from Colonel David Moore's 21st Missouri Infantry of Prentiss Division advance towards the sound of gunfire in Fraley's Field and encounter Powell's men pulling back from the fighting. Moore, unaware of the mass of Confederate troops in his front, is incensed by what he sees as cowardice and relieves Major Powell of command. Just after 7 a.m., he advances into Say Field to your right as you leave the footpath. Here he is met by a sudden fire from Confederates behind a fence at the far end of the field. The captain and sergeant of the lead company are killed immediately. Moore receives a bullet in the right leg that shatters his shin bone. A junior officer runs to Major Powell, who has been relieved of command but not yet left the scene, and cries out, "For God's sake, Major, take command! The colonel is wounded!" As the fighting dies down slightly, Powell, aware of the strength of the force facing him, withdraws the company back towards the division camp to the northeast. At the headquarters of the Army of Mississippi to the south, the debate amongst the Confederate commanders over attack or withdrawal is cut off by the sound of musket fire coming from Fraley's Field. General Johnston calmly announces, "The battle is open, gentlemen. It is too late to change our dispositions." In a questionable abrogation of his role as overall Confederate commander, Johnston assigns his second-in-command, General Beauregard, to remain behind the lines and take responsibility for the tactical movement of troops in response to evolving circumstances during the battle. He then mounts his horse to head for the front, remarking confidently to an aide, "Tonight we will water our horses in the Tennessee River." Stop 2. Shiloh Branch. You are now at a section of a creek known as Shiloh Branch. As the fighting goes on in Fraley's Field, the brigade of Brigadier General Patrick Cleburne, on the left flank of the 1st Confederate line of General Hardee, advances past Fraley's Field, intending to flank the Union right. They cross wet, swampy terrain of tangled undergrowth, only to find themselves along a northerly section of the Shiloh Branch you are looking at here. To their dismay, they find their route blocked by a large quagmire known locally as the morass. Cleburne attempts to lead his men across, riding boldly into the marsh. Very quickly, however, his horse is belly deep in sticky mud. Panicking, the animal rears and throws Cleburne into the mud. Collecting his dignity, the general carefully remounts. He realizes there is no way through the morass. He has no choice but to divide his forces and move them around instead, with 4 regiments moving west, Cleburne himself with his other 2 regiments going east. In the dense terrain and confusion of battle, Cleburne will not manage to reunite the 2 halves of his brigade for the rest of the day. Stop 3. The Peabody Monument. Colonel Everett Peabody, listening to the gunfire coming from Fraley's Field, stands in his camp in the area you are now in, reading a note sent to him by Major Powell informing him of the large Confederate force he has encountered on the patrol that Peabody ordered earlier that morning. Suddenly, General Benjamin Prentiss, Peabody's division commander, arrives at the camp in a temper. He demands of Peabody what is going on. The colonel explains that he has sent out a patrol. Prentiss erupts, accusing his subordinate of possibly bringing on a general engagement without authorization. He insists the officer will be held responsible for his actions. In response, as the sound of fighting draws nearer, Peabody mounts his horse, offers a cursory salute, and shoots back, "If I brought on the fight, I am to lead the van." He lines up his 4 regiments of Michigan, Missouri, and Wisconsin men in battle formation barely before they are struck by more than 2,000 Confederate troops. General Prentiss rides off to assemble the rest of his division and seek reinforcements. By 8 a.m., Peabody's brigade, in danger of being flanked by the numerically superior Confederate force, slowly withdraws back through Prentiss Campground from your front towards your left rear. The presence of thousands of tents, along with heavy artillery fire, destroys all unit cohesion. Colonel Peabody, though wounded 4 times, rushes about on his horse attempting to rally his troops when a bullet passes through his skull, killing him instantly. Major Powell, who led the reconnaissance mission that opened the battle and was accused by Colonel Moore of cowardice, is also killed. Within 45 minutes, the entire brigade collapses. Those who can flee desperately back towards Pittsburgh Landing. Stop 4. Spain Field. As the Confederate attack is shattering Peabody's brigade to the west, General Prentiss posts his 2nd Brigade of about 3,000 under the command of Colonel Madison Miller at the northern edge of Spain Field in front of you. They are supported by Captain Andrew Hickenlooper's 5th Ohio Battery in the northwestern corner of the field and Captain Emil Monk's 1st Minnesota Battery beyond that. At about 8:45, Miller's men are hit by the southern troops of Brigadier General Adlai Gladden's brigade. The rebels meet a withering fire from Miller's soldiers. Yankee gunners employ canister. Gladden is struck with a shot that nearly tears his left arm from the shoulder. He yells to his aide, "Scott, I'm struck! Let's go on!" An instant later, he is forced to admit, "It's a serious hurt. Help me down, Scott." The mortally wounded commander is carried into an ambulance and evacuated to the rear as his men pull back. But the Federals quickly find themselves in serious trouble. With the collapse of Peabody's brigade to the west, Miller's right flank is now exposed. General Prentiss' attempt to shift the men to meet this threat disrupts the blue line at the very moment that Gladden's brigade, now under the command of Colonel Daniel Adams of the 1st Louisiana, rallies and attacks again, with Robertson's Florida Battery moving to within point-blank range of the Bluecoats. By chance, at the same moment, Brigadier General James Chalmers' brigade arrives and strikes the Federals from their left. Artillery Captain Andrew Hickenlooper remembers that Chalmers' men came in with a rebel yell that caused an involuntary thrill of terror to pass like an electric shock through even the bravest heart. Both sides suffer heavy casualties, with the 1st Louisiana losing 28 killed and 89 wounded in about 20 minutes of fighting. Hickenlooper's Ohio Battery is hit by devastating fire, with 59 of 80 horses killed. By 9 a.m., Miller's brigade collapses, and his men, like Peabody's before them, flee northwards. The Southerners overrun 2 of the guns of Hickenlooper's battery, but Yankee artillerymen manage to withdraw the remaining 4 pieces by hand. Captain Monk is hit in the thigh, but all 6 of his guns of the Minnesota Battery are safely removed. Having shattered Peabody's and Miller's brigades, the Confederate attack stalls. The poorly trained and famished Southern boys, finding themselves in possession of the now abandoned Union camp of Prentiss Division, halt their advance to help themselves to the riches of the Yankee tents. Many of them, new to combat, believe the battle is over and they intend to collect their spoils of war. In the camp, Dr. Samuel Eels, 12th Michigan surgeon, continues to treat the wounded, along with the rest of the medical staff as his comrades rush to depart. As he works inside a bullet-riddled tent, rebel soldiers move in and "Some leveled their guns at us, and we rather expected them to shoot than otherwise." However, Confederate General Thomas Hindman arrives and guarantees their safety as Southern surgeons set up an aid station nearby and make use of medical supplies captured from their northern foes. In the midst of the joyous pillaging, General Johnston appears and reprimands one of his officers who is emerging from a tent with a handful of booty. "None of that, sir," the army commander snaps at his junior subordinate. "We are not here to plunder." Then, seeing the horrified look on the young lieutenant's face, Johnston softens and, in a move that surprises all with him, he reaches down from his horse to a nearby table, takes up a tin cup, and announces, "Let this be my share of the spoils today." Stop 5. Ray Field. You're at the north end of Ray Field, northeast of Fraley's Field, where the battle has opened. Camped here is the advance unit of General Sherman's division, the 53rd Ohio of Colonel Jesse Hildebrand's brigade, commanded by Colonel Jesse Appler. It is approaching 7 a.m., and Appler has aligned his regiment to the southwest towards the sounds of the fighting coming from Fraley's Field. Suddenly, one of his men points out to him Confederate troops advancing towards him from the south. Appler shifts his line to face that direction and moves them forward just beyond the camp. But then, the increasingly agitated colonel receives reports of enemy skirmishers to the east in the woods around Shiloh Branch. Realizing there are rebels on 3 sides of his regiment, Appler announces, "This is no place for us!" He withdraws his men north through the camp to the edge of a wood and faces them east. He sends a dispatch to Sherman informing him of the heavy presence of the enemy all around him. Sherman remains skeptical that there is any large Confederate force nearby and sends a response telling Appler, "You must be badly scared over there." Nevertheless, he places the rest of his division in battle line to the north and rides with his staff officers to meet with Appler and assess the situation for himself. In the woods to the west, Confederate skirmishers from the regiments of Patrick Cleburne's brigade that have headed east around the morass reach the western edge of Ray Field. Sherman arrives in the field in front of you, still skeptical that any serious attack is underway. He rides about 200 yards ahead of his lines and gazes through binoculars at the movements he observes at the southern end of the field. Suddenly, one of his aides calls out, drawing his attention to the west. There, Sherman sees Cleburne's rebel skirmish line, muskets already leveled to fire. Instinctively, Sherman raises his right arm as though to defend himself as shots ring out. Projectiles, likely buckshot from the poorly armed Confederates, strike Sherman's upraised hand. A ball smashes into the skull of the orderly next to him, Sergeant Thomas Holliday, killing the man instantly. "My God, we're attacked!" Sherman yells out as he wheels and rushes back to the blue lines behind him. He gives a snap order to Colonel Appler to hold his position, promising to send him reinforcements. Then he rushes off to alert the rest of his division, commenting on the way to a cavalry officer he encounters, "The devil's to pay, sure enough." It is now about 7:30 in the morning, and General Cleburne's troops rush from the woods to your right towards the spot where you are standing and hit Colonel Appler's 53rd Ohio. The Blue Coat Infantry, with the support of Captain Waterhouse's artillery stationed by Ray Spring to your left and slightly behind you, inflict a withering fire on the attacking Rebs, who are forced to withdraw back into the wooded ravine around Shiloh Branch. Cleburne reassures his men, calling out, "Boys, do not be discouraged. That was not the first charge that was ever repulsed." They attack a second time, are driven back once more, rally and come on a third time and are yet again repulsed. Just before 8 a.m., the 6th Mississippi attempts a fourth attack. they are again driven back, having suffered 300 casualties of its original strength of 425. They will ever after be known as the Bloody Sixth. But numbers finally tell, and at around 8 a.m. the inexperienced Union troops and their commander suddenly break. Although the 53rd Ohio has driven off 4 Confederate attacks with relatively few losses and holds a good position, Colonel Appler cries out the order, "Fall back and save yourselves!" His men are stunned and confused, but when they see their colonel fleeing in fear, they begin to follow suit. The 53rd collapses. The other 2 regiments of Hildebrand's brigade, the 57th and 77th Ohio, have no choice but to pull back and attempt to form a new line further north to hold back the Confederate attacks. Stop 6. Shiloh Church. With his troops driven back from Ray Field, General Sherman sets up a tenuous defensive line in front of his headquarters by the Shiloh Church. He places the 2,200 men of Colonel Ralph Buckland's brigade, supported by 2 batteries, in a strong defensive position along a ridge to the southwest, to your right, with the brigade of Colonel John A. McDowell on his right, along the Purdy-Hamburg Road, to your right rear. In the meantime, Colonel Jesse Hildebrand, having seen Appler's 53rd Ohio driven from Ray Field, pulls the other 2 regiments of his brigade, the 57th and 77th Ohio, and positions them on a ridgeline just southeast of Shiloh Church, to your front left. Captain Waterhouse's battery keeps up a heavy supporting fire on the advancing Southerners. At about 8 a.m., Patrick Cleburne's other 4 regiments, about 1,500 men that were forced west around the morass, strike Buckland's position to the right in a series of ferocious but uncoordinated attacks. They are met by a blaze of musket and artillery fire and repeatedly driven back with heavy casualties. The 2nd Tennessee, stumbling into the crossfire produced by the Federal Brigade's position, loses 13 officers and nearly 100 men of the 365 that move into the fray. The colonel of the regiment, William Old Grits Bate, is just lighting a cigar when he sees his younger brother Humphrey fall with a mortal wound. For the rest of his life, Bate will chew on cigars but never light one. Shortly thereafter, Colonel Bate himself is struck by a bullet that passes through his leg and into his horse. Surgeons will attempt to amputate the shattered limb, but Bate will refuse at the point of a pistol. He will survive, but will ever after require a crutch to walk. Bate's assault, like all the others by Cleburne's men, is repulsed, and the brigade is largely shattered. At the same time, General Braxton Bragg, commander of the Confederate 2nd Corps, orders his men to hit Hildebrand's troops to your left. Confederate artillery to the south along the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road support the assault. The attack is driven back, largely as a result of withering fire from Waterhouse's Union guns. At about 9:30 a.m., General Bragg sends forward 5,300 men in a fresh attack against Hildebrand. Still, the Ohioans beat back repeated assaults. Confederate Colonel Andrew Blythe of the Mississippi Rifles Regiment is killed. His second in command, Lieutenant Colonel D.L. Herron, is mortally wounded. Their brigade commander, General Bushrod Johnson of Polk's 1st Corps, is severely wounded by a shell fragment. Finally, approaching 10 a.m., the 57th Ohio gives way. The battery of Captain Waterhouse, who has been wounded in the leg, is now exposed. Waterhouse limbers his 6 guns and pulls them out, but fewer than 300 yards back, Major Ezra Taylor, Sherman's chief of artillery, orders him to unlimber and begin firing again. The order dooms the battery as the 13th Tennessee strikes Waterhouse's unit from the left. 3 of the 6 guns are lost to the rebels. A 4th is damaged and must soon be abandoned. Seeing the collapse of the 57th on his right, and now having lost his artillery support, the 77th Ohio breaks and runs for the rear. A Union artilleryman of Buckland's nearby brigade reports on the flight of the men of the 77th, saying that some of our company drew revolvers on the cowards, but nothing could keep them to their posts. He adds that Colonel Hildebrand, the commander of the collapsed brigade, sat down on a log near me and cried like a child at the cowardice of his men. During this time, General Sherman has been coolly directing the battle as best he can in the area of Shiloh Church. In addition to the wound in his hand, he has had 2 horses shot from under him, a bullet cut his horse's reins, and another deflect off the metal of his epaulette. Now, seeing the collapse of Hildebrand's brigade to the east, he sends orders to Buckland's brigade for them to withdraw north to the intersection of the Purdy, Hamburg, and Pittsburgh Corinth roads, known locally as the Crossroads, where he intends to form a new line. Stop 7. The Crossroads. It is now 11 in the morning. Sherman's troops have been pushed back from Ray Field and Shiloh Church and are attempting to gather in this area, known as the Crossroads, the intersection of the Purdy-Hamburg Road you just traveled on and the Pittsburgh-Corinth Road, now Sherman Road. Though by now the attacking Confederates are also disorganized, exhausted, and have suffered heavy casualties, they nevertheless push hard towards the shattered Union right wing. They smash into the Federals of Colonel Julius Wraith's brigade of Major General John A. McClernand's division, which has moved south in support of Sherman. A battery of the 6th Indiana Artillery under Captain Frederick Baer rushes to support the Blue Infantry. As they begin to unlimber, a bullet kills Baer instantly. The remaining gunners panic, and under the disgusted gaze of General Sherman flee for the rear, abandoning all but one of their guns. Another bullet shatters the leg of Colonel Wraith. He will die 5 days later. The Union troops, many having run out of ammunition, are forced to retreat. By 11:20, the Confederates are in full possession of the Crossroads. They continue to rush forward in pursuit of the fleeing Northerners. Stop 8. Wolf Field. Having driven back Sherman's and Prentice's divisions, the Confederates renew their assault at about 10:30 a.m. after taking time to ransack the overrun Union camps. Their next target is the Army of the Tennessee's 1st Division of Major General John A. McClernand, which is camped behind Sherman's division. By now, however, the Confederate units, disordered by terrain, pillaging, and fighting, are hopelessly jumbled together. Brigadier General Thomas C. Hindman of Hardee's Corps finds himself leading 2 regiments of Polk's Corps in an attack against Colonel Carroll Marsh's brigade, which is supported by Captain Edward McAllister's Illinois battery. Hindman charges in front of his men, whooping like a Comanche and with his horse on the dead run. Highly visible in a white oilcloth poncho, Hindman becomes the target of McAllister's gunners. Very shortly, a shot blasts into the rebel general's horse, obliterating its front end, sending Hindman somersaulting into the air and then crashing to the earth. He manages to struggle to his feet, wave his sword towards the enemy, and blurt out, "Tennesseans, take that battery!" He then falls unconscious to the ground and is carried to the rear. Colonel Robert Shaver takes over the attack and is joined unintentionally but serendipitously by the brigade of Brigadier General Sterling Wood. As the rebels move forward, the smoke hanging over the field is so heavy that the Federals mistake Wood's Southerners for friendly troops and cease firing. This allows the Tennesseans to get within 30 yards of the enemy line before opening a devastating fire. Marsh's brigade collapses, followed by Colonel Abraham Hare's brigade to its left. With no infantry support, Captain McAllister, suffering from 4 minor wounds, has no choice but to withdraw his guns. With so many of his horses killed, he is forced to leave one of the four pieces behind, surrounded by 31 dead and 160 wounded men of the attacking 4th Tennessee. The hard-driving Southerners also capture all 6 guns of the 14th Ohio Artillery. By about 11 a.m., only Colonel James C. Veach's brigade remains intact in Hurlbut's division. The charging Rebs focus on them, and heavy fire is exchanged. Major William R. Goddard, second in command of the 15th Illinois, is killed. A moment later, his commander, Lieutenant Colonel E.F.W. Ellis, wounded in the arm, shouts to his men, "Stand firm! Do your duty, boys!" He falls with a bullet through the heart. The 46th Illinois is caught in a crossfire and loses half of its soldiers on its right. Major John W. Foster writes, "Our men tried to stand up to it, but everything was breaking to pieces all around us." Veach's brigade collapses, and the men flee to the rear. As Sherman's and McClernand's men retreat before the rebel onslaught, the brigade of Colonel John A. McDowell on the right of the Union line pulls back along the Purdy-Hamburg Road. Near Crescent Field, the 6th Iowa Infantry Regiment suddenly divides in two, some companies continuing to retreat, others turning and heading back to the now abandoned line of battle. Colonel McDowell rides urgently over to find the commander of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Morco Cummings. He finds instead a junior officer, demands to know the meaning of the regiment's bizarre behavior. "It means," the junior officer replies resignedly, "that the colonel is drunk." A furious McDowell relieves Cummings on the spot, replaces him with Captain John Williams, and the regiment completes its withdrawal. The Confederate advance once again stalls as the famished rebels stop to rummage through the well-stocked enemy camps they have overrun. Although they collect much bounty, they also encounter the horrors of war. In the camp of the 6th Iowa, an officer entering a tent in search of treasures discovers a Yankee victim of Confederate shelling, the lower part of his body torn away, his head cradled in his hand. Stop 9. Jones Field. The Confederates' pause to raid the Union camps gives Sherman and the other Union commanders time to regroup their shattered forces. They manage to assemble about 2/3 of their troops, albeit in a jumbled state, here in Jones Field and across the road to the west in Sowell Field. They are joined by the brigade of Colonel John A. McDowell after his complicated withdrawal through Crescent Field. McDowell has not yet been engaged in the battle, and his men are therefore fresh. Major Ezra Taylor, Sherman's chief of artillery, collects 9 guns from McClernand's division and engages in a long-range duel with Confederate gunners stationed in the now occupied camp of the 45th Illinois in the northern end of Wolf Field, which you saw at the last stop. Once they have established sufficient strength and order, Sherman and McClernand launched the first Union counterattack of the day from these fields at about noon. Their regular line is a badly jumbled mix of units from various divisions. Only 14 regiments of the 22 present are able to advance. Nevertheless, the audacious attack catches the disorganized troops of Robert Russell and Preston Smith of Polk's Corps by surprise, and they give way. Stop 10. Cobb's Battery. The Southern artillery exchanging fire with Sherman's guns in Jones Field, the location you just left, consists of the single remaining cannon of Captain Marshall T. Polk's Tennessee Battery of Polk's Corps, and the 6 guns of Captain Robert Cobb's Kentucky Battery from Breckinridge's Corps, who occupy this location. During the bombardment, a shell strikes one of Cobb's gunnery teams, killing 2 men and tearing both hands from a third. The wounded man stares down in shock at the bloody stumps at the ends of his arms, then blurts out, "My lord, that stops my fighting." As the Union counterattack surges forward, Cobb and Polk are forced to cease firing when they run out of ammunition. Iowa troops of McClernand's division overrun Cobb's and Polk's batteries here. Stop 11, Wolf Field. You are now back in Wolf Field, where we earlier saw the Tennessee State Memorial in the southern end of the field. The surprise Union counterattack on the Federal right drives the Army of Mississippi all the way back to this location. The Confederates, however, received strong reinforcements in the form of Colonel Robert Trabew's 1st Brigade, some 1,600 strong, moved up from Breckinridge's corps. They surprised the 550-man 46th Ohio of McDowell's brigade, giving the Yankee commander, Colonel Thomas Worthington, time only to shout, "Squat, boys, squat! Damn you, squat for your lives!" before they unleash a withering fire that staggers the Bluecoats. The Federal advance begins to slow and transforms into a series of brutal local firefights, often hand-to-hand. From the left of the rebel line, Colonel Preston Pond's brigade joins the assault. They sweep in ahead of Trabew's brigade. Unfortunately, the blue uniforms of the Orleans Guard and the 18th Louisiana cause them to be mistaken for Yankees, and they take friendly fire. The men shelter in a ravine and desperately attempt to alert their comrades by waving their flags. In another half hour of fighting, with reinforcements rushing in on each side, the Rebs managed to retake Cobb's and Polk's guns. The Federals, in danger of being flanked on their right, slowly withdraw. By 1 p.m., the Union counterattack is over. Both sides have suffered heavy casualties. McDowell's Yankee Brigade, which had entered the attack as yet unbloodied, has been devastated, suffering more than 30% casualties. On the Confederate side, Sterling Wood's brigade has lost 62% of its strength, and Patrick Cleburne's brigade is entirely shattered. Sherman and McClernand pull back to their starting point in Jones and Sowell fields, then withdraw further to a line along the Hamburg-Savannah Road behind a deep ravine called the Tilghman Branch. The Confederates halt their advance in order to reorganize and resupply their troops. Famished soldiers continue to ravage the overrun Federal camps, feasting on hot bread and butter, sardines, fruit, and wine. Stop 12. Sarah Bell Cotton Field, southern end. At 8 in the morning, as attacks continue against the divisions of Sherman and Prentiss to the southwest, Grant's 4th Division commander, Brigadier General Stephen Hurlbut, having already sent one of his brigades to reinforce Sherman and Prentiss, begins to move south with his remaining 4,100 troops. By about 8:30 a.m., they reach Sarah Bell's cotton field in front of you. Hurlbut deploys his 2 brigades in the southern end of the field where you are now. This is problematic since, rather than having a clear field of fire, the men face the woods behind you that will allow enemy troops to approach closely without being seen. The line is supported by 2 batteries, one Missouri and one Michigan. Almost an hour later, Hurlbut's 3rd Battery, the 13th Ohio Artillery, under the command of John B. Myers, arrives. As Myers moves to take up his position, scattered musketry and artillery fire opens on Hurlbut's men. One of the shells strikes a caisson of Myers' battery, exploding violently, killing 1 and wounding 8. Panic seizes Myers and his men, and they flee to the rear, abandoning their guns. Another shell strikes 1st Brigade Commander Colonel Nelson Williams. He is thrown to the ground and injured so severely that he will be paralyzed for weeks, eventually being discharged from the service. Colonel Isaac Pugh of the 41st Illinois takes command of the brigade. Hurlbut's men expect the skirmishing and artillery fire to turn into a full Confederate attack at any moment. But Confederate Commander Albert Sidney Johnston has shifted troops away from Hurlbut's front towards the heavy fighting to the west. Brigadier General Jones M. Withers is left with only a single brigade of 1,500 exhausted men and wisely decides not to send them against Hurlbut's 4,100 fresh troops. Stop 13. Sarah Bell Field, North End, the Peach Orchard. Confederate General Withers' decision to hold off on any attack in Sarah Bell Field gives General Hurlbut time to reconsider the wisdom of deploying his brigades facing the tree line at the southern edge of the field, the location we just left. He pulls them back to the farm lane you are now standing on at the north end of the field and has them take position behind a rail fence just south of a peach orchard. This old wagon passage will become famous as part of what will be called the Sunken Road, though, as you can see here and at a number of other stops, very little of it is actually much deeper than the surrounding ground. Hurlbut soon receives reinforcements, extending the Federal line along the sunken road. To his right, General Prentiss takes up position with the remnants of his division. Grant's 2nd Division, under General W.H.L. Wallace, the most northerly of the Army of the Tennessee units, has rushed south, and most of these men take up the line to Prentiss' right, stretching the developing Federal line all the way to the eastern Corinth Road. One of the brigades, however, the Scottish Highlanders, adorned in tams, under Brigadier General John A. MacArthur, along with Battery A, 1st Illinois Artillery, extend Hurlbut's position from here to the left. These men come under immediate artillery and small arms fire that will continue intermittently for the next 3 hours.